Before Herr Baumeister would become a prolific, horrible serial killer, he was a pillar of his community. He was a doting father. He was a loving husband. His neighbors enjoyed spending time with him because he was high energy and he threw great parties. But what people didn't know from outward appearances is that he was schizophrenic and had been diagnosed at a young age. He also had this deep obsession with death and dying that he could never quite shake. His morbid obsession would ultimately take over, and he would go on to end the lives of nearly 24 young men in Indiana. And he would bury the majority of them on his property, which was known as Fox Hollow Farm. When an investigation into all these missing young men in Indiana points at Herb Baumeister being the primary suspect, Baumeister flees his property and ultimately ends his own life. And in the note he leaves, he just says that the reason he's taking his own life is because his business is failing and so is his marriage. He doesn't confess to any of the murders. He doesn't give investigators any indication of how many people he killed or where they are. He didn't give any closure to anyone. He just took his own life, and that was that. And so while investigators did a very thorough search of the property that Baumeister owned, the Fox Hollow Farms property, and found over 5,000 human bone fragments and were able to identify a number of victims, they believe that there are more victims buried at Fox Hollow Farms that we may never uncover. So our story picks up over a decade later when two new owners come in, purchase Fox Hollow Farms, and almost immediately some very strange things start happening in and around the property. Then they record this very famous audio recording inside the property, which that in conjunction with the other strange things that they had seen around the property leads them to believe that Fox Hollow Farms is haunted. So before we get into their story and we listen to that audio recording, if you're interested in strange, dark, and mysterious content like what I'm promising on today's episode, then you've come to the right place, because this is the type of content that I produce 3 to 4 times a week. And so if that interests you, if you would, please gently assassinate the like button and then turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of these uploads every week. So let's dive in. In 2006, Rob, Vicky Graves, and their 2 teenage sons were tired of living the city, fast-paced lifestyle and decided to look for some property in suburban Indiana where they could kind of escape that busy lifestyle. And so when they were looking at real estate in some of the nicer suburbs of Indiana, they found this one property called Fox Hollow Farms that was this huge, sprawling estate, but was selling for some unbelievably cheap price. And so they contact a real estate agent who says, yeah, we'd love to give you a tour of the place. It's up for sale. No one's occupying it right now. It's owned by an investor, but they are looking to sell, obviously. So yeah, let's do a house tour. And so they're open-minded. It seems too good to be true, but they decide, you know what, we'll go take a look. And so they get to this property, and it's beautiful. It is everything they wanted this dream home they're looking for to be. You know, it has an indoor swimming pool. It's got loads of bedrooms and bathrooms. It's like basically a mansion. And as they're walking around the property, Rob is speaking to his wife, Vicky, and they're both kind of going back and forth like, what's wrong with this place? This doesn't make any sense. Rob starts to wonder, wait a second. I think I've heard of this place on TV before. And he's having like an epiphany. And he's like, I think that this could actually be the home of one of the most notorious serial killers in Indiana's history, Herb Baumeister. It's like it just came to him that the name Fox Hollow Farm was something he remembered hearing on TV. And so he stops the real estate agent on their tour and he says, hey, this is a beautiful home, but is this the home of Herb Baumeister? And the real estate agent, almost expecting this to be brought up, was like, yes, that's why it's still on the market. People are unwilling to purchase this home, even though the investor who scooped this up in the 90s, following the tragedy that was the Herb Baumeister case, the investor had basically gutted the whole residence and basically removed all the kind of remnants of what it used to look like when Herb Baumeister was living there. Nobody wanted it because, you know, Herb Baumeister had killed nearly 24 young men and buried them on the property, and investigators still were finding pieces of bone on the property. And they didn't really know how many victims there were. And so it was this kind of spooky place to live. And so the real estate agent just said, that's why it's so cheap. The property's beautiful, it's well kept, but no one wants to be here because of the history. The real estate agent says, here, why don't you and your wife just go talk about it? We can leave if you guys aren't comfortable with this. Ultimately, they decide to purchase the property. So a couple weeks later, Rob and Vicky and their 2 teenage sons move into Fox Hollow Farms, and they love it. And especially their 2 teenage sons love swimming in the pool. And they had gotten in the habit of basically running around outside and then tracking in dirt and gravel into the swimming pool. And so one day, Vicky is vacuuming up some of this dirt and gravel that had gotten inside of the area around the pool. And so she's vacuuming up the gravel, and all of a sudden her vacuum cuts out. And in fact, the power cord where the vacuum was attached to had come undone. And so she thinks, oh, I must have yanked on the cord and pulled it out of the outlet. And so she goes over and she plugs it back in, and she goes back to vacuuming up the gravel that was in the pool. And so as she's doing that, it goes out again, which surprised her because she remembered thinking to herself, like, don't yank on the cord because you just unplugged it. And she turns around, and now the cord from the vacuum and the outlet it was plugged into are separated by about a foot. That it was as if it had been like yanked out pretty hard. And she's thinking to herself, like, did I just yank on it again? Like, am I wrapped on a chair or something? Like, how did I yank it out, and how did it move a foot away from the outlet? And so after she plugs it in, she checks it and kind of yanks on it to make sure it's not falling out on its own. Like, it's not a, kind of weak connection to the port. And it's not. It's in there secure. And she goes back to vacuuming, and she's looking over her shoulder and checking the outlet as she's vacuuming, like wondering, like, what was causing it to pop out of the socket like that? And as she's looking at it, she watches it pop out of the socket again. Except it didn't just fall to the ground. It like jumped out, as if there was a surge of electricity that, popped it out of the socket or something. And she drops the vacuum because it startled her, and she didn't know what to make of it. Rob worked at a car dealership, and one of his employees, Joe, was chronically late. And it got to the point where Rob's like, Joe, what's going on? Like, why are you always late? And Joe said, I live over an hour away, and I can't get here on time. I got to find somewhere, to live that's closer to the dealership. And Rob is like, well, actually, we have an entire apartment attached to our residence at Fox Hollow Farms that no one's staying in. We'd be happy to let you rent that out. It's right down the road. And Joe's like, actually, that sounds pretty great. And so just a couple days later, Rob helps Joe move into the new apartment. And they spend the whole day moving all the boxes and furniture in there. And just in the span of just a few hours, they move everything into Joe's apartment. Rob leaves. Joe is exhausted. It's just he and his dog, Fred. And Joe just decides to crash for the night, and he lays down in the bed and falls asleep. And so that night, he has this dream where he's being chased by someone. He doesn't know what it is, but it causes him to actually act out his dream, like sleepwalk. He jumps up out of his bed and starts running as if he needs to escape the apartment, but he's like kind of half dreaming, and he runs into the door frame, falls to the ground, knocks a glass over, and actually cuts his hands up pretty bad. And so he like comes to, and he's like looking around, and he's like, what was that? So a couple days later, Vicky comes home, and she finds Rob painting the side of the house. And she and Rob stop and are talking about how beautiful it's going to look when the painting's done. And out of the corner of her eye, Vicky sees something in the forest that was on the edge of their property. And it was actually a man standing with a red t-shirt on, just standing like looking at their property. And as she's looking at him, he turns around and he starts walking away farther into the forest. And so she kind of looks, and before she says anything to Rob, the guy has just vanished into the woods. And so she just goes, Rob, I just saw someone standing on our property. He had a red shirt on, and he was right over there. And Rob immediately is like, well, honestly, we moved into a serial killer's house. We should accept that there's going to be people that are just going to want to sneak onto our property to get a look at this building. And so they walk over to where Vicky has seen this guy in red, and they look, and there's no one there. They yell out, like, hey, is anybody here? And no one's there. And so even though it was pretty unsettling, Vicky and Rob just decide that I guess this is a reality of living here, is that you're going to have people spying on you a little bit because of the notoriety of the home. So later that night, Joe is in his apartment, and he's doing some dishes, and it's late at night, probably like 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and he hears a knock on the door. And he's literally mid-dishes, his hands are wet, and so he turns off the water, and he yells out, hey, just a second, and he starts toweling off his hands, and as he's doing that, the knocking gets louder and more aggressive. And he's like, hey, hold on, I'm just drying my hands off, hold on. And he assumes it's Vicky or Rob. And so he starts walking over, and the knocking is just incessant. And he finally opens the door, and no one's there. It wasn't like the knocking was going on and stopped, and then he went over there and opened it. It was literally like the knocking was happening as he's opening the door, and no one is standing there. He's like immediately on guard. Like, okay, is someone like on the roof, like bending down? Is someone hiding? Like, what's going on? And he kind of pokes his head out and he's looking around, and he actually steps out onto the front steps there, and he's looking around. And he figured, like, if someone had knocked, they'd be running away if they're gone already, and he can't hear anything. It's just silent. There's no one there. And then he goes back into his apartment, shuts it, bolts the door shut, and out of the corner of his eye, he spots what looks like a man in his bedroom, basically just walking past the door frame into his bedroom. And it totally startles him. His dog starts growling and looking in the direction of the bedroom. And so he walks over there and looks in his bedroom, and there's nothing there. He flips on all the lights, he looks around, and he's like, what's going on here? Like, it totally scared him. So Joe had only been in this apartment for about 3 weeks, and one of the things he had kind of developed a habit doing was in the evenings he would take his dog Fred for a walk along the driveway that was, well lit, and the driveway was pretty long. It's a big piece of property, and he would take his dog up to the end of the driveway and then walk back. And because of what he's just witnessed with the knocking on the door and what looked like someone in his apartment, he decides he just wants to clear his head and go on a walk with his dog. And he figured he could maybe swing by the main house and see if the lights were on in Rob and Vicky's house, because in some way, maybe if their lights were on, it would indicate that maybe they had been over and had been knocking on his door, and tomorrow he'll find out what it was about. Like, he's searching for a way to rationalize this. And he notices right away that Vicky and Rob's house is totally dark. They're asleep. He doesn't make it very far when his dog stops. The dog starts taking off into the tree line. And before Joe actually takes off after his dog, he looks up and he breaks out through some of the lighting over the driveway that there is a man in red with a red t-shirt that's at the edge of the forest. And his back is turned and he's walking into the forest, and as Joe's looking, it looks like the man in red actually disappears. And so the dog is heading straight for this man in red, and so Joe, because it's his dog, he loves his dog, he starts running after the dog. Even though he's absolutely terrified of what's going to happen here, he couldn't let his dog get harmed. So he chases into the woods, makes it like a few feet into the woods, where he finds his dog that's now not barking and is actually facing back out at Joe. And it's kind of cowering, looking at where Joe is now standing. And Joe kind of begins to turn, and the man in red is standing right next to him, looking directly at Joe. And Joe just panics and starts running out, doesn't stop to do anything. The dog follows Joe, and they run back to Joe's apartment, run upstairs, shut the door, shut the blinds, lock everything, and they just sit there. For the rest of the night, Joe is literally checking his window and looking outside, because he doesn't know if he just saw that or not, because that person in red had vanished a minute ago. He thought that perhaps he was convincing himself that he saw someone in red because he had just seen like a ghost in his apartment like a few minutes earlier, and he's starting to think that maybe he's just kind of hallucinating all this stuff, or that he's imagining all this stuff. So he wasn't quite prepared to go tell Rob and Vicky or do anything about it. So he just spent the night basically looking out his window and making sure no one was coming into his residence again. And so the next morning, he goes and tells Rob and Vicky what happened the night before. Everything from the knocking on the door to the person that he thought he saw inside of his apartment, to then ultimately the man in red that his dog chased after. As he's telling them about this exchange with the man in red, Vicky is getting pretty emotional. And Vicky is like, I saw a man in red. And she points to the area of their property, and it's the same area that Joe had just been describing where this had all happened. She was like, I saw a man in red right over there. Like, what's going on? So that night, Joe is in his apartment, and Joe is definitely on edge about what had happened the night before. He's increasingly almost listening for noises outside because of how scary the night before was. And he forgoes his walk on the driveway with his dog. I think he's pretty much done doing that after that encounter. And as he's in his apartment, he hears knocking on the door again. And he yells, who is it? Who's at the door? And no answer, but the knocking continues. And it's one of those knockers. It's the actual knocker on the outside of the door that's being hit over and over again. He can see the door actually shaking from how hard this is being banged against the door. And finally, after like poking his head out and seeing no one, he rips the door open and no one's there. And he looks at the door itself, and the knocker is perpendicular to the ground, like someone's holding it up, but no one's there. And as he's looking at it, it swings down and knocks the door one last time. He slams the door shut, locks it, and he's absolutely petrified. He sees the doorknob on the door start to turn. He can hear the sound of the spring tightening as the doorknob slowly turns all the way over into the open position. The door's locked, but the doorknob's been twisted. And he's looking at the door, and then there's silence after the doorknob's being held in the, call it, open position. And then all of a sudden it bursts open, breaking the lock. No one's outside. And he looks at it and he's absolutely frozen for a second. And then he just runs out of his apartment to see who is doing this. No one's there. When he turns around and looks into his apartment, he sees a man in white, not in red, who is soaked head to toe, screaming and running towards him, who runs out of the apartment past him and vanishes into the air. And so he takes off. Joe, he's not sticking around, grabs his dog, runs to Rob and Vicky's, and he goes in and tells them what happened. Joe, Rob, and Vicky are so scared that now they're not trying to rationalize that this wasn't a ghost, let's say. They're trying to convince themselves that this is a friendly ghost, that these are the victims of Herbert Baumeister that have been tormented by Baumeister, but they're here because they're trapped here. That man you saw in your apartment, that was a victim of Herbert Baumeister, escaping from Herbert Baumeister. The man in red, that was a victim of Herbert Baumeister. We're dealing with the victims here because so many people had their lives snuffed out here. And so it isn't really calming them, but it's like they're creating a narrative that fits what's happening. Because without a story, this is impossible to understand. And so they really start to believe that what they're experiencing is a haunting, but it is of Herb Baumeister's victims basically acting out their final moments or kind of leading them to, what happened to these victims. And so that night, Joe, Rob, and Vicky start going online and researching who the victims were, the known victims of Herb Baumeister. And there's images of all of these different victims. And as they're scrolling through all the pictures, Joe stops them on one and he goes, "That's the guy that was in my apartment. It looks exactly like the guy that was soaking wet, screaming, that ran out of my apartment." Like, that confirms, this is a confirmation to the three of them, that the entity they're experiencing in this property is definitely the victim. So they do feel reassured at this point. Scared, but reassured that these are the victims. And so they start really aggressively researching the Baumeister case, and they come to realize that there's actually a number of victims, more than likely, that have not been uncovered, that have been buried on this property, only lending in their mind more credibility to the idea that this is a property that is haunted by the victims of Herb Baumeister. And so after a couple of days where there isn't much activity, Joe decides to go for a walk in the woods in the same area where the man in red had been seen by Vicky and by himself a couple days earlier. And he just decides, in broad daylight, I'm going to go for a walk with my dog out in the woods. And so he starts walking in that direction, and literally sitting on the leaves, like practically on the trail in plain sight, is a human bone. It's a femur bone just sitting on the trail. Like, the idea that that bone wouldn't have been located during the extensive search for bones on this property is nearly impossible. To Joe, the way he described it is, I feel like that bone was left there for me to discover it. That the man in red, who was more than likely a victim of Herb Baumeister, had led me to finding that bone. And so they believe, Joe, Rob, and Vicky, that when they send this bone in for forensic analysis, that they'll determine that this was another victim that perhaps hasn't been identified yet. And they're kind of expecting it to be the man in red, whoever that was. And so Rob ends up calling the lead detective from the Baumeister case and says, "Hey, we found a bone." And so they submit that and they take it in as evidence. And Rob asks the lead investigator if he would mind coming to the property and just kind of explaining to them, where things occurred, on the property relative to the Baumeister case? Where did all the tragedy unfold? Like, where were people buried? Just to give us a sense of what we're dealing with here. And so the investigator agrees, and the investigator comes out, and the vast majority of the killings happened in the swimming pool, where Baumeister would basically lure young men to come to his property to go swimming. And as soon as they got in the pool, he would strangle them to death. And the weird thing about the pool area is that Baumeister was, well, a psychopath, and he had put mannequins all over the inside of this swimming pool that had like party outfits on. And so there are these very eerie pictures of the swimming pool with like mannequins all around the outside, and it was basically a place where he lured his victims and ended their lives. A couple days later, Joe is in his apartment, and he's doing some work at his computer, and he hears a metallic scraping sound coming from his kitchen. And so he goes over to his kitchen, and he finds that all of the knives that were in his butcher's block have been pulled out and lined up neatly in the bottom of his sink, like very neatly arranged. And he's looking at it like, I didn't do that. And he turns towards his workstation, like as if to like look around the room, and he notices on the island that sits where he was standing right in front of him, a little bit low down, like halfway up the island, there was all these fresh cut marks in the wood, like quite a number of cut marks across the wood. And he's looking at that, and he's thinking to himself, is this one of the victims telling me that, perhaps they had been attacked with a knife right here in the kitchen? He's thinking like it's his duty to try to figure out which victim this was and what happened to them. And so he gets his iPhone out, and he turns on the voice recorder, and he starts recording and asking some questions of the room. And he first make sure to turn off the TV, turn off the AC so it's quiet. And so with his recorder, he starts asking, like, who's anybody here? And there's silence. And he's like, who was the person in the kitchen? Who was walking through the kitchen? And there's silence. And then when he asks again about was there anybody in the kitchen, his dog starts growling and reacting to something in the room. And now Joe hasn't heard anything. He's not heard any confirmation that, there's someone in the room. He actually felt quite silly doing it. He takes his phone back to his computer because he takes his dog growling as maybe somehow confirmation that there was something there. And he downloads the audio file, and he listens to it. And as he's listening to the file, right after he asks about is there anybody in the kitchen, he gets a response.
Who keeps walking in the kitchen?
Who's in the kitchen? The married one. And so as Joe is looking through all their files, he's seeing that every single victim was single. No one's married. They're all young men who are single. The only one who was married, involved in this case, was none other than the serial killer himself, Herb Baumeister. And so Joe has had this revelation, and it's when he realizes that it's not just the victims here. Herb Baumeister, the serial killer himself, is haunting this property. So I'd love to hear what you think is going on at Fox Hollow Farm, whether this is a haunting with Herb Baumeister himself showing himself and speaking on audio files, or if this is just a big hoax. I'd love to hear what you think. And if you want to get in touch with me, please direct message me on Instagram. My handle is johnballin416. I'm also very active on TikTok. My handle is Mr. Ballin over there as well. And again, if you haven't already, please gently assassinate the like button and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss my 3 to 4 weekly uploads that look and sound an awful lot like this one. A 1979 New York Times article described her story as being, quote, one of the Western world's most intriguing and convincing cases of reincarnation. I myself am not a huge believer in reincarnation, mostly because any of the stories I've heard, there's no modern day corroboration of fact. But in Dorothy Eady's case, or as she became known, Setti's case, she has a number of things that line up with her story, with her lifelong story, that she in fact was from ancient Egypt and was actually a priestess in ancient Egypt times. And some of her discoveries are pretty incredible. And frankly, Egyptologists and historians that have looked at this case have spent decades trying to prove that she was lying, but can't. She had information that she shouldn't have had. That begins to make you wonder, maybe she really was reincarnated. Before we get started, if you could please gently destroy the like button and then go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on all notifications, that would be great. I'm going to be posting a ton of content just like this as many times a week as I can. I'm aiming for 3, if not 4, every week going forward, so please come along. The too long didn't read version of this story is you have Dorothy Eady, who as a child has a near-death experience. When she kind of comes back, she believes that she is no longer home, that her home is somewhere else. She starts having dreams about this place. She describes this garden and this big building, and then eventually she discovers that what she's describing is a place in ancient Egypt. And she ends up becoming obsessed with ancient Egypt and then begins providing information and helping with archaeological digs that leads to numerous incredible discoveries. All from memories that she claims to have had from her previous life. Even if you don't believe in reincarnation and this whole story seems like totally made up, just listen to how the story flows and then try to make sense of how in the world she had the information she had that led to distinct discoveries that nobody else had made. That they found this stuff as a result of Dorothy Eady's information. How do we reconcile that? It's not impossible, but no one's been able to do it yet, so let's see what you think. Dorothy Eady was born into a lower middle-class family in London in 1904. She was an only child, and she was absolutely adored by her parents. Now, unfortunately, when she was 3 years old, she fell down a flight of stairs in her home and was unconscious. They called the doctor, and the doctor shows up and says she's actually dead. As the parents are talking to the doctor, after about an hour, Dorothy gets up and goes into her bedroom and is like playing on her bed. And the parents come in with the doctor and they can't make any sense of it. And in fact, the parents were furious at the doctor for pronouncing her dead because they're like, obviously she wasn't. If she's just fine now, like, who are you? What kind of doctor are you? The doctor swears she was dead. Shortly after the accident, Dorothy develops a strange accent that they can't quite place. And doctors and specialists believe that she's suffering from something called foreign accent syndrome, which is fairly common amongst people with significant head injuries. Basically, it alters your speech, and to people that don't know any better, they might think that you just have a strange foreign accent. Dorothy also started telling her parents about this recurring dream she had, where she'd be near this huge building with these big pillars, and she'd be in this beautiful garden. She loved this garden. She talked about the beautiful flowers and her friends that were there, and it was just this unbelievable place. It was like this oasis next to this building. But she didn't know where it was, and she's 3, 4 years old, so she's not able to articulate much what this is, but she was just in love with this garden and this location in her dreams, and she talked about it endlessly. Dorothy's mother would find her daughter on her bed either before she went to sleep or when she woke up, crying because Dorothy longed to actually be in this place in her dreams, which she started calling home. Now, Dorothy's mother would say, but Dorothy, you're home now. And she would say, no, I'm not home. My home is in that garden. It's near that building. And no matter how Dorothy's mother tried to kind of convince her that, no, honey, you live here now. You live here. You've never lived anywhere else. Dorothy was unbelievably convinced that what she was seeing in her dreams was her actual home. It was around this time that Dorothy's parents brought Dorothy to a British museum where they had a big ancient Egyptian exhibit set up. And when they went into the museum, Dorothy sees this exhibit and she's immediately attracted to it. And as she gets closer, she starts seeing the statues of the pharaohs and pictures of the pyramids, and she sprints into the exhibit, runs away from her parents, and she's running to the different statues of the pharaohs and of the Sphinx and all of these different icons from ancient Egypt, and she's kissing their feet and she's sobbing hysterically, and she's yelling, I'm home, I'm with my people. This little tiny kid is having this revelation that she's found home, and she refused to leave the museum. Finally, her parents, get her to calm down. They're pretty embarrassed as people are like looking at them like, what's going on with your child? She finally leaves with her parents, but at this point, now Dorothy has attached that place in her dreams that she longs to go with the beautiful garden. She's attached it to Egypt, to ancient Egypt. And so she becomes completely obsessed with ancient Egypt. Her obsession with ancient Egypt started to get her in trouble. When she'd go to Sunday school, Her family is a very, very devout Catholic family. She would compare Catholicism to other ancient Egyptian religions. That got her in a lot of trouble, and in fact, they said, you can't come to Sunday school anymore. Then she got expelled from her Catholic school because she refused to sing a number of the hymns that in some way disparaged Egyptians, ancient Egyptians. She was also told that she could no longer attend Sunday Mass for the same reasons. She was basically not welcome anymore. At 6 years old, Dorothy, who knew how to write and read in English, started to take a keen interest in hieroglyphics, the Egyptian hieroglyphics, and she said that they were definitely familiar to her, but she had forgotten how to read it. When she was 7, she was looking through a textbook and she saw a picture of the Temple of Seti I, which is in Abydos, Egypt. And as soon as she saw the picture, it was a big picture of the temple, and then next to it kind of like the broken remains of what looks like maybe a garden of some kind. And she immediately said, that is my home. That's where I'm from, right there. Temple of Seti I in Abydos, Egypt. That's my home. And as she's looking at the picture and she's looking at those kind of tattered, broken remains, I mean, this is thousands of years old, she's looking at the area next to this big temple in the picture. And she's like, that's the garden, but where are the trees? Where is everything? Why does it look like this? Like, she didn't understand that was thousands of years ago that it was a garden. But she saw the picture and immediately knew it as her home. Also in the textbook was the picture of the pharaoh, Seti I, who the temple was named after. And when she saw the picture of the very well-preserved mummy, she was overcome because she claimed to have known him personally. At age 10, Edie was kind of discovered by world-renowned Egyptologist E.A. Wallace Budge, who offered to teach her how to read and write hieroglyphics, which she picked up almost instantly. Starting at 14, in addition to that recurring dream of the Temple of Seti and the garden right next to the Temple of Seti that she claimed was her home, she started having a recurring nightmare where she, in her former life, was in this subterranean enclosure, and she was being questioned by a high priestess who was demanding that she answer her questions, and when she refused, she was beaten. At 27 years old, Edie meets an Egyptian man and falls in love with him, but also, I'm sure on some level, she was marrying him to secure Egyptian residency, because as soon as they got married, they moved right back to Egypt, where she could be a resident. And actually, when they landed in Egypt, the first thing she did, she's overcome with emotion when she lands, and she starts kissing the ground and crying and saying, I'm home, I'm home. Dorothy and her Egyptian husband have a son, and they name him Seti, just like the pharaoh Seti. Once Edie moved to Egypt, she started, by her account, getting visits from an entity known as Hor-Ra. Now, Hor-Ra, she claimed, was the spirit of the pharaoh Seti I. She would get into these almost trance-like states at night over that first year she was in Egypt. It was like she'd be sleeping, but then she would get up and be in this trance, and she would start frantically writing in hieroglyphics in the middle of the night. And her husband would wake up, and he would see her doing this, and she was like, he couldn't stop her. He couldn't communicate with her. She was just in a trance, recording what she was claiming Hor-Ra was telling her, was dictating to her that she needed to write down. And it was, in fact, about who she used to be. She used to be, according to Hor-Ra, a woman by the name of Ben Trishit, who lived 3,000 years earlier in the time of Pharaoh Seti I, and who lived in the Temple of Seti in and around that garden. So after a year of her going into these trances and writing in hieroglyphics, she had over 70 pages of transcript of what she claims was her story. And it goes like this. Before being born as Dorothy Edie, she was an Egyptian woman named Ben Trishit. Her father was a soldier, and her mother was a vegetable seller who actually died when she was just 3 years old. Unable to care for her, Ben Trishit's father placed her in the temple of Qam el-Sultan. She was then raised at the temple where she later became a priestess. When she was 12 years old, Ben Trishit was given two choices: either venture out into the world on her own or become a consecrated virgin and stay at the temple. Ben Trishit decided to take the vows. But a few years later, she meets Pharaoh Seti I, and they end up falling in love, and soon she becomes pregnant. When she is discovered to be pregnant, she was interrogated by the high priest and beaten when she refused to answer, a scene that corresponded to her childhood nightmare. Unwilling to put her beloved Seti through a public scandal, Ben-Turshit took her own life. Edie's husband grew increasingly disturbed watching his wife go into these trances and write out the hieroglyphics. I mean, she's amassing all these pages of hieroglyphics. Her whole thing was just too much for him, and so he ultimately filed for divorce in 1936. Following the divorce, Dorothy and her young son leave and go live in another town near the Giza pyramids, and she starts going by the name Seti, which means mother of Seti. So she doesn't go by Dorothy Edie anymore. And at this point, she also takes a job with Egypt's Department of Antiquities, and she begins a very lengthy and highly successful career in Egyptology. For nearly 20 years, Seti would research almost exclusively the temple of Seti I and learn everything about not only the temple but the people who lived there, because it was where she believed she used to live. But it wouldn't be until 1952, when she's almost in her 50s, that she finally actually steps foot in Abydos. And it was because of a job transfer that put her there. And in fact, she took a pay cut to get this job. She was so desperate to just finally step foot in the place that she believed was her old home. As soon as she walked into the temple, the first thing she says is, "It's as if I've lived here before." And she quickly sets up an office in one of the temple rooms and spends almost all of her time there. And she even befriends a cobra and feeds the cobra daily, and just has this cobra friend that just hangs out with her, which no one could make any sense of. Lots of rumors swirled around whether this woman was sane, but because her contributions to Egyptology were so pronounced and so useful, that she was very highly regarded. But of all of her accomplishments, of all of the things that she did, the thing that she is most known for is when she was able, as soon as she got to the temple of Seti I, identify exactly where the garden was. For Seti, she'd been having dreams of this garden her whole life. And so she very quickly said, "If you dig here, you're going to find this garden." And sure enough, they dug down, and there was the garden. And in fact, she had described the layout of the garden, what trees were where, what types of trees were there, and it was all confirmed. And once they dug it up, she was also instrumental in identifying where to dig on the north side of the temple, where she said there was a tunnel that ran underneath. It was a secret tunnel. And sure enough, they dug down, there was the tunnel. That was something that they had never seen before. Only she knew about it, and there was no way she would have known about it without prior knowledge. In addition, she also pointed researchers to search in a specific area, in an area known as the Valley of the Kings, for a tomb, a long-forgotten tomb. And sure enough, almost exactly where she described, there was in fact a tomb that had never been discovered before. As much as other Egyptologists did not want to accept Seti's claims that she had been reincarnated, and that's why she has all this knowledge, they wanted, frankly, it to be just the ramblings of a crazy person and it to just be some elaborate hoax, but they couldn't deny the fact that she had intimate knowledge of certainly everything that ever happened at the temple of Seti I in the time frame that she claimed to have been living there, 3,000 years prior. Fascinatingly, right before she died, when she was 81, she said that there was a secret underneath the temple of Seti I. There was a secret chamber, and there was a secret within that secret chamber. But no one's ever gone down there. No one knows where to begin to look. And so without Seti guiding them, it may be one of those things that we'll just never know. So without any sort of rational explanation for how she would have had all this knowledge or understanding of an ancient culture, it leaves skeptics wondering, I mean, is this potentially a real case of reincarnation, or is there a better explanation? And I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. There is a house in Gary, Indiana that has been dubbed the Demon House. Now, if you were to walk past this house on the street, it wouldn't stand out to you. It's very modest, single-story, 3-bedroom home. Looks like all the other houses around it. But the history behind this house is totally bizarre. Latoya Ammons, who was a mother of 3 that lived inside of this house with her 3 kids, she began to report to the police that demons were throwing her children against the wall. Now, when police got the report that children are being thrown against the wall, their first thought is, you're an unfit parent. And so they sent Child Protective Services and the police to go check out this residence and make sure that she really was a competent parent. They are shocked at what they find. And what they find is documented in a police report. And courtesy of the executive producer of 317 Films, Christopher Geizot, I have a copy of said police report, and when I read through this thing for the first time, I literally wrote him an email and said, this is fake. There's no way this is an actual police report. And he said, no, that's real. It's from the Lake County Sheriff's Department. It is the official police report, and it's mind-blowing. Today, I'm going to tell the story of what happened when the police got involved, and I'm just going to use information that was in the police report. But before we get into today's crazy story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all I do, and I upload 3 to 4, even 5 times every week. And so if you're interested in that, I would encourage you to gently take the like button out for a nice seafood dinner and never call it again. That's so weird. And also sub to my channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's get into the story. After numerous reports that Latoya Ammons was mistreating her children, based on reports that she gave, she was telling police that demons were throwing her kids around the house. Based on those reports, Child Protective Services was sent to do a home study, to go to their house, go to Latoya Ammons' house, and make sure it was a safe, clean place for children to be living. In addition to the case manager, her name was Valerie Washington, who was going to be going over to do this home study, the Lake County Sheriff Department also sent over Lieutenant Gruszka, who would be assisting Valerie and watching the home study take place. When Gruszka arrives at the house, he is met with Valerie Washington, also Latoya Ammons, the mother, and her 2 sons, Andrew, who's 9, and Amante, who's 7, as well as Latoya's mother, so the boy's grandmother. Her name was Rosa. Washington, the case manager, pulls Gruszka aside out of earshot of Latoya and her family, and she starts telling Gruszka about what happened at the hospital 8 days earlier, because she, the case manager, had already begun investigating Latoya Ammons and that whole situation with her kids. 8 days earlier, Washington was at the hospital sitting in a waiting room. Washington was with a psychologist, and they were speaking to Rosa, who was the grandmother of these children. In the room was also Andrew, the oldest son, and Amante, the youngest son. And as they're chatting, Amante, the youngest son, stands up and walks to the middle of the waiting room. And his eyes roll back into his skull, and he begins emitting this growling sound that sounded too deep for a boy of 7 years old. The grandmother reacted to it like she had seen it before. She got right up, she marched over to him, and she took him by the hands, and she yelled, "You are not you." And she kept saying that, and the boy's eyes are still back in his head, and he's not responding to anything his grandmother's saying. As Rosa is repeating over and over again, "You are not you," Amante begins backpedaling towards a wall behind him. And Rosa holds his hands the whole time. She's holding his hands firmly. He gets to the wall, and instead of stopping, he puts his foot up against the wall. This is a 7-year-old boy, and begins walking up the wall by pressing against Rosa. And she's holding on tight, and he's pressing back at her and using that weight to walk backwards up the wall. The psychologist in Washington are just watching in disbelief. Rosa's holding on to him as he walks all the way up to where he's on his tippy toes on the wall. And then he flips forward in front of her and lands on his feet on the other side of Rosa. The psychologist and Washington literally run out of the room, and they go get a doctor, and they explain what happened. The doctor comes in, not having any clue what to make of this, and just says to the boy, "Can you do that again?" And Amante at this point, his eyes are back to normal, and he's sitting now next to Rosa, and he says, "What? I didn't do anything," and acted like he had not been walking up the walls. Now, it's not in the report how Lieutenant Gruszka responds to Washington's story about the hospital. However, the entire police report that I'm pulling all this information from is written by Lieutenant Gruszka at the end of the investigation. So this exchange between he and the case manager, Washington, about the hospital visit that he was not part of, it apparently carried weight in the entire investigation that he felt compelled to add it into the report. Even though on paper, you would think if you're doing a home study for this house, why would you incorporate something that didn't have anything to do with the house? It gives you maybe an insight into Lieutenant Gruszka, although his language remains super professional and very pragmatic, that perhaps Lieutenant Gruszka at the end of this investigation was starting to think this might be paranormal. After this story, 2 more police officers show up to the house to assist with this home study. One was Brian Miller and the other was Charles Austin. At this point, the 3 officers, Gruszka, Miller, and Austin, along with the case manager, Washington, begin walking towards the family and towards the front door of the house. LaToya says that she and her kids will not go back in the house because they had moved out very recently because of the strangeness that they claim was happening inside of the house. They felt like they were under attack by demons. And so the police, they needed someone to bring them in. And so Rosa, the grandmother, LaToya's mother, she offered to go in with them. So the house is a single-story, 3-bedroom house. You walk in and you're inside of the screened-in porch. You go into the main level. There's a few bedrooms, and then there's a stairwell that leads down into the basement. And so they go in, and Lieutenant Gruszka is in charge of taking pictures and recording audio the whole time they're in the house. They were not aware that they had already moved out. So it's a bit of an awkward home study because they're not even living there anymore. But either way, they're going to do their job. They're walking around, taking pictures of each of the bedrooms. There's 3 bedrooms, there's a kitchen, basic stuff upstairs. And then they go downstairs to the basement. Now, the basement was where LaToya and her family claimed the majority of the paranormal activity was taking place. The steps leading down to the basement were wood. They went down into the basement. The basement floor was concrete and the walls were concrete blocks. As they go down, Lieutenant Gruszka would notice that there were candles that had been placed all over the basement floor that had burned down to their wick. There was also an altar and a nativity scene that had been placed near the underside of the stairs. And so when Gruszka goes over to take pictures of the altar and the nativity scene, he recognizes that under the stairs, near where those 2 things are placed, it's all dirt. The concrete that made up the floor of the basement had been broken away, and there was jagged pieces of concrete where there should have been a continuous flow of concrete underneath the steps. It had been snapped up and broken away. It was gone. When Rosa was questioned about the strangeness of the basement with all the candles and the altar, she just said that there's a presence down here, and that's all she was able to articulate. The other officers and the case manager and Rosa, they go back upstairs, and Lieutenant Gruszka and Charles Austin, the other officer, they stay in the basement and take a few extra pictures, a couple more underneath the stairs, and just of the candles before they ultimately go upstairs as well. When Gruszka comes upstairs, Rosa's waiting for him, and she's about to turn the light off leading down into the basement, and she asks him, "Did you get any pictures underneath the stairs?" And he said, yeah, I did. I stayed down there and I took some more pictures. She looks at him and she says, "Sometimes at night when we're sleeping on the main floor, we'll hear commotion in the basement. It sounds like maybe someone bumping on the underside of the stairs. And then you hear footsteps walking up the wood steps. And whatever it is stops on the other side of the door leading into the main floor, and it will stay there for hours. And we're too scared to open the door to look." Gruszka goes back to his office and he immediately uploads the pictures that he took with a focus on the ones he took in the basement. And he finds that there is a couple pictures he took under the stairs, that in the right-hand corner of the picture, just behind one of the steps, it's partially obscured, is a white mist or a white cloud. And he zooms in on it and he brings in other officers and they look at it. And if you zoom in close enough, it looks like a man's face. As they're zoomed in on this mist underneath the stairs, they can see, only because they've zoomed in, that there appears to be a faint green mist on the left side of the picture. It appears to be a woman's face. Gruszka and Austin, who were the only 2 in the basement at the time of these pictures taken, swear they did not see a white or green mist under the stairs when they took pictures. Gruszka, again, it doesn't say in the report how he's feeling, but you can imagine he's starting to feel a little bit uneasy about what he's witnessing, Gruszka just goes to his audio recording. And so he fast forwards to the section where he and Austin are alone in the basement taking these additional photos. And you can clearly hear on the recording Gruszka and Austin talking to each other as they're taking these pictures. And at some point, as they're taking these pictures of the basement, a third voice, not Austin, not Gruszka, say directly into the audio recorder,
"Hey!"
The audio recorder was one that Gruszka was used to using, and it had never malfunctioned before. And he and Austin were the only ones down there. And so they couldn't explain where the third voice was coming from, and neither could any of the other officers who listened to it. On April 30th, Gruszka set up a meeting with Latoya Ammon's priest, who she was very close with. They were regular churchgoers. This priest, his name was Father Maginot, he had been at the Ammon's residence 5 days before this home visit was done, when Latoya Ammons and her family was still living in that residence. And so Gruszka went to interview him to get a sense of what it was like when they were still living there. Father Maginot said he was there because Latoya had reached out and said, "I don't know what to do," because she's claiming there are demons here. And while they're sitting in the living room on the main floor, Father Maginot is telling Gruszka that the bathroom light started flickering on and off. And so it was distracting enough that ultimately Father Maginot got up and walked over to the bathroom, and as soon as he went inside, the flickering stopped. And then he'd go back down and sit down, and it would start again. Repeatedly, Father Maginot would get up when it was flickering, he would go in and it would stop, he'd come back and it would start flickering again. So while this is happening and Father Maginot is going back and forth to the bathroom trying to figure out why the light is flickering, Latoya points out that a liquid is forming on one of the window blinds in the room that they were all sitting in. There was this oily liquid substance that was just kind of trickling down the window blinds. And Father Maginot walks over and looks at it. They're all looking at it, and there's no leak in the ceiling. There's no source for this liquid, and it hadn't been there before. At least that's what Latoya Ammons and her family is saying, that that's not from us. We don't know what that is. As they're looking at this oily substance on the blinds, the cord that controls the blind itself starts swaying back and forth. And everyone's startled as they're looking at it because there's no draft in the room. The window's not open. There's no reason it should be swaying. While they're looking at this cord, Father Maginot looks down and sees this huge footprint in the carpet near where they're standing that was too big to be his, and nobody else in the house had a footprint that was that big. At this point, Father Maginot doesn't think it's safe for the family to be there and advises her to leave. And this would actually be the episode that prompts Latoya Ammons and her family to leave the house and not come back. On May 10th, Lieutenant Gruszka, a new Child Protective Services case manager, and a host of police officers go back to the Ammons residence. The Ammons residence has been unoccupied with all utilities shut off, locked and sealed since the last time they were there, which was on April 27th. So it's a 2-week period that no one has been in the house. But there was a customary follow-up to this house. They had to as part of the home study. When Lieutenant Gruszka arrives at the property, outside is Father Maginot, as well as Latoya Ammons, her mother, Rosa, Latoya's 2 sons, Andrew and Amante, as well as a host of police officers. There's a canine unit that's there. Although it's not said explicitly in the report, it would appear that the reason there's all this additional police presence in a canine unit is because there's enough weirdness being reported about the house. There could be a home invasion situation happening, that somebody else is living in this house. Any number of things could be happening, but they can't write off all of the strange testimony about what's happening in the house. And so before they go in for this second home study, they have one of the dogs from the canine unit go into the property and search the property for intruders, just in case this was a home invasion or something like that. They wanted to just check the box. So they send the dog in, the dog comes out, hasn't found anything unusual. And so the police, along with Father Maginot, the case manager, and Rosa, they go back into the house. The main level looked untouched. There was nothing strange happening in the main level when they walked around. Nothing was disturbed. It looked like no one had been here in 2 weeks. So they open the door to the basement, they turn on the light, and a couple weird things happen right away. One, they notice that on the steps, on the wooden steps leading into the basement, there is an oily substance with no clear origin that goes all the way down the steps, snakes around the side, and disappears underneath the stairs. As they begin walking down the stairs, the case manager from Child Protective Services happens to touch a cabinet that had been built into the walls along the stairwell leading down into the basement. And immediately she pulls her hand back. She grabs her pinky and she reacts like something had hurt her. And they ask, "Hey, what's going on?" And she's like, "I don't know. I just touched the cabinet and my hand now hurts. My pinky hurts. It's tingling." And it apparently had turned white. We don't have any images to show that, but her pinky basically had been wounded just from touching this cabinet. And so the officers go down into the basement and they follow this oily trail that goes back under the stairs. And they're thinking to themselves, all the utilities have been turned off. There's no reason there should be any water down here. Not to mention there's no origin for this oily substance. And no one's been in the house for the past 2 weeks. So we can't even account for this by saying that one of the family members might have spilled something. And so even though it's not written into the report that they were scared or that they were considering this could be beyond rational explanation, it's clear from what happens next that everybody there was ready to explore the idea that something was happening underneath the steps. Because now the family's claimed there's been something crawling out of there and walking up the stairs at night. You have this strange oily substance coming from the underside of the stairs. You have the white and the green apparition inside of the pictures. Father Maginot suggested that if there was some sort of demonic possession happening in the house, that there's a good chance they would find things underneath the steps that were tied to the family. And so they decide they're going to dig up the dirt underneath the steps. And so Gruszka begins digging into this dirt patch under the steps. And he makes it about 2 feet down. And he finds a press-on pink fingernail. He also finds women's underwear. And as he keeps digging, he finds a political pin, like for your t-shirt. He also finds the lid to one of the cooking pots from upstairs. He continues to dig and he finds some trash and miscellaneous papers. And it dawns on the group that someone or something is leaving the basement, going into the main section of the house, taking things from the family, going back downstairs, going underneath the steps, and burying them. And probably has been for some time. And so at some point they stopped being able to dig any farther. The soil was too hard, so they put the soil back and decide to leave the house. As they're leaving the house, Rosa is the last one to leave, and she actually says, "Hey, come over here." And she's standing in that screened-in porch, and she's looking up at the window blinds. On the window blinds in the house is that same, or it appeared to be the same, oily substance trickling down the blinds that matched the description of what Father Maginot had said he had seen when he was visiting the family before and saw liquid coming down the blinds. And so the officers reacted to this by saying, "Rosa, did you do this? Are you responsible for putting this liquid on the blinds?" And she said no. There was no clear source for this liquid. There was no leak. There was nothing. And so Lieutenant Gruszka wipes the liquid off of the blinds and tells everyone to leave the house. For 25 minutes, they waited. And then they went back inside to see if there was going to be liquid there, and there was. And Father Maginot would say that after that first time he was there and he saw the liquid dripping down, he did some research. And it's very common over the history of time that if there's any sort of demonic possession in a house, that liquids will ooze from different areas in the house. And it's this oily substance that matches the description of what they just saw. At this point, Lieutenant Gruszka and the police tell everyone to vacate the premise. They lock it up and they leave. And that is the end of the police report. Although not included in this police report, where I pulled all of the story from, Charles Austin, who was the other officer who was in the basement with Lieutenant Gruszka when they were taking pictures underneath the steps and they heard that voice on the recorder. Well, Charles Austin actually worked for another police department, the Hammond Police Department, and he took some pictures of the outside of this house during the time that no one was staying at the house. And one of the official police pictures shows a shadowy figure standing in the screened-in porch of this house right near where that liquid was dripping down the blinds. In 2014, Zach Bagans, who's a popular paranormal investigator, he hosts the show Ghost Adventures. He purchased the Demon House and filmed a documentary that he called The Demon House, and you can check that out for yourself. And he demolished the house in 2016. There is nothing quite as satisfying as a true story that's mysterious and interesting, it sucked you in, that has a killer plot twist, a killer reveal. That, to me, is just the most satisfying thing you can find. I am a complete story addict, and so I go looking for these stories. I go literally searching for real-life stories with real-life plot twists. And in my opinion, the very best one is the story of the missing lighthouse keepers, and that is the story I'm going to tell today. So the too long didn't read version of this story is a crew is sent out to this lighthouse off the coast of Scotland. They're being sent out there to relieve the workers that are there, provide new supplies, and just kind of make sure everything is okay. When they get out there, nothing is okay. The 3 lighthouse keepers are missing. The island and the lighthouse are kind of in disarray. And then they find the lighthouse keeper's logbook, which, needless to say, is very strange. It has some entries in it that don't really add up. And then when you combine those entries with what some people had to say on the mainland that were watching the island, it really doesn't add up. So it creates this really epic plot twist. It's absolutely worth watching to the end, I promise. So let's get there. Off the coast of northwestern Scotland lies a stretch of 7 small islands. It's called the Flannan Isles. One of those isles is called Eilean Moor. And on Eilean Moor is a lighthouse, and that's where our story is going to be centered. But before we get into the story, Eilean Moor has some odd history to it. It's long been regarded as a place that's paranormal. In fact, on the island, basically the only people that inhabit it are the lighthouse keepers. Usually there's 3 or 4 of them, and sheep. And so sheep herders often go out to that island, and they're the ones that report hearing strange sounds and just feeling like they're being watched. It's a creepy place. And in fact, anybody that visits the island that isn't a sheep herder or a lighthouse keeper, even if they've never heard of the history of Eilean Moor, oftentimes report a very odd sense of being watched, of just not feeling right on that island. And so Eilean Moor really had developed a reputation as being a pretty creepy place. So in addition to just the strange aura around the island that basically anyone who went there reported, anybody that went to the Church of St. Flannan is its name, they reported feeling like they were being drawn to pray, that there was this overwhelming sense that you should be praying as soon as you walk into the church. And in fact, the draw was so strong, like getting on your knees and praying, that they developed this strange ritual that when you got to the island, it was customary that before you went in, you immediately dropped to your knees and crawled around the church on your knees before making your way inside and continuing to pray. So just a strange place with strange rituals. That's the scene that is set for this true life, very strange mystery. In December of 1900, a steamboat was passing by the Flannan Isles, and as they rounded their way past Eilean Moor, they noticed that the light was out. The lighthouse was not operational. And so when that steamboat finally got to port 3 days later, they told authorities that, hey, Eilean Moor is not operational. You should go check on them. And so as it happened, it was actually time to replace the lighthouse keepers that were at Eilean Moor. So Captain James Harvey gets his crew together, and he takes Joseph Moore, who's the replacement lighthouse keeper, and they head out to Eilean Moor to check on the lighthouse, check on the lighthouse keepers, but also replace them. So it was a changing of the guard and making sure that everything was okay. As you approach Eilean Moor, you would see a massive staircase coming up from the dock all the way up to where the lighthouse is. So from a distance, if you were looking at Eilean Moor, it would be fairly easy to break out anybody that was walking down the steps to get down to the dock. And since the island was really only inhabited by lighthouse keepers and sheep, the crew, Captain Harvey and his crew, as they're making their approach to Eilean Moor, they're watching those steps to see if the lighthouse keepers are going to notice them and come down and greet them on the dock, because that was customary. You always are at the dock ready to assist the crew as they come into Eilean Moor. That was just the way it was done. And so as they're making their approach, they're watching these steps, looking for signs that the keepers are coming down. Because on some level, the crew that's going out to replace them, on the back of their head, they're a little bit nervous that something's wrong. I mean, they know that the lighthouse was not operational, and that's part of the reason they're going out. So they're kind of like actively watching those steps. They're looking for signs that they're coming down to the dock. And as they get closer and closer, they don't see anybody come down the steps. They don't see anyone on the dock. And even worse, no preparations were made for the next crew to come into the dock. That was something that all lighthouse keepers did. They kept that dock, up to code so that if any time someone came in, they could properly dock and make their way up. So no preparations are made. No one is coming down to greet them. So the omen is pretty bad. And so Captain Harvey and his crew, they dock on the dock, and the captain and his crew say, hey, to Joseph Moore, you go up and just do a cursory examination of the island. Make sure these guys are okay. We'll stay down here for a minute. You go check. So Joseph Moore gets out, and he starts walking up this massive set of stairs where he can't see the lighthouse. He can only see the steps. It's pretty steep. And later he would say that he had this deep sense of just foreboding, like something bad is about to happen. He felt very stressed out as he's walking up these stairs. And as he makes his way up, he finally kind of crests to where he can actually start to break out the top of the island where you can see the lighthouse and you can see, where they were staying. And the first thing he notices is the steel railings that line this massive staircase up to the island near the lighthouse itself. The steel railings had been bent over. Like, imagine if it was made out of tinfoil. They had been folded onto themselves. Like, pretty significant damage to, steel railings. And so he makes note of that. And he also notices that this big boulder that just, I don't think it was decorative. It just was on the island. And so they built around it. There's this huge boulder that just was right in front of the lighthouse. And it had been that way for, years and years. It had moved significantly. And you could actually see a trail underneath the boulder where it had rolled across the grass. So Joseph Moore, the replacement lighthouse keeper, is thinking to himself, my God, this is straight out of the storm of the century. Like, clearly the worst storm ever has hit this island. No wonder their lighthouse was non-operational, because they were hit with, the worst storm ever. And so that's his initial assessment. He goes up to the door. The door is unlocked, but shut. And he opens it up. First thing he does is he yells for the lighthouse keepers that are supposed to be there. They don't call back. There's apparently no one in the lighthouse. Before he even starts moving through the lighthouse, he looks on his right and he sees all the hooks where they would have kept their clothes. And one hook still is holding an oilskin jacket. And anytime you would leave the lighthouse, especially if you were leaving the island for some reason, there is no reason in the world you would not be wearing that jacket. So it's another kind of bad sign. It means that if they're not here, if the three lighthouse keepers are not inside of this lighthouse, why aren't all three oilskins gone with them? It's another sign that something terrible has happened. He looks into the kitchen, and on the kitchen table is plates of meat. There is, pickles that have just been pulled out of a jar, and a couple of the chairs have been upturned. And he also noticed that the mechanical clocks had stopped. And so he's thinking to himself, okay, something happened where they left in a hurry because they toppled over chairs, they left food on the table, someone forgot their jacket. He continues moving through the lighthouse and he gets to their bedrooms, and all of their beds are unmade. Again, it was kind of customary that you would never leave the lighthouse unmade. You would make your bed because someone else could be coming in to relieve you. And so it was yet another sign to Joseph Moore that something had happened suddenly that caused the lighthouse keepers to abandon the lighthouse. Combining that with the massive damage from the storm, he's starting to think, something happened, this horrible storm is coming through. Like, maybe it got really bad really quickly and they didn't have time to make proper preparations. They didn't have time to do the things that were customary. They just had to kind of boogie out of there. So Joseph Moore returns to Captain Harvey and says, this is what I saw. And so Captain Harvey and the crew go back up and they kind of see it for themselves. And Captain Harvey ends up sending a telegram back to the mainland explaining that there has been a horrible tragedy here. A dreadful accident has happened at the Flannans. The three keepers, Ducat, Marshall, and the Occasional, have disappeared from the island. The clocks were stopped and other signs indicated that the accident must have happened about a week ago. Poor fellows. They must have been blown over the cliffs or drowned trying to secure a crane or something like that. After Captain Harvey sends this telegram, he and Joseph Moore and the rest of the crew continue to kind of search the island and do some investigating. And they discover the logbook that the 3 lighthouse keepers had been keeping. And so all of the entries are pretty standard. It was, common practice that you would mark down what happened that day, what ships you saw, just kind of basic log keeping of the lighthouse. But they start getting really interesting on December 12th. On December 12th, the leader of the 3 lighthouse keepers noted that severe winds, the likes of which he had never seen before, he's been doing this for decades, are passing through the island. And he's acting pretty worried about whether or not the lighthouse will be able to withstand this storm. He also noted that the other 2 lighthouse keepers were not doing well. He said one of them had been basically just praying nonstop. The other had been doing a bit of crying. Now, the man he's describing that is crying over the intensity of the storm was known on the mainland as one of the toughest, saltiest men on the planet, who had weathered dozens of hurricanes out on islands all by himself. And so for him to be crying over the severity of the storm just shows you how severe the storm really was. The entries on the 13th and 14th point to them believing that they're not going to get out of the storm alive. At this point, all 3 of them are just praying nonstop and are kind of anticipating at some point they're just going to get swept off the island. Then on December 15th, it just says, storm ended, sea is calm, God is over all. So Robert Moorhead, who is one of the leaders of the investigation, said that basically on December 15th, after that final entry was made, they must have gone down to the dock to secure some of the supplies and just kind of make sure that it wasn't totally damaged from all of the storm, and a rogue wave from this storm must have swept them away. When word got to the Scottish mainland about what had happened to these lighthouse keepers, the people that sat on the coast facing Eilean Moor, they were really confused, because whenever there's a storm out at Eilean Moor, they can see it because the island's not that far off the coast and they can see the storm. But over the past few days, namely December 12th to the 15th, which was the time period those log entries were made about the storm passing through, the people on the mainland of Scotland said that not only was there no storm, but in fact, the visibility onto Eilean Moor was better than it had been in years. They saw parts of the island that were only visible in perfect circumstances, meaning there was never any storm. So what the heck happened to those lighthouse keepers? What were those log entries about? Why were they drawn to tears? How did the railings get flipped over and the boulder get moved aside? Where did they go? In the years following their disappearance, other keepers were sent out to man that lighthouse, and all of them reported hearing someone yelling the names of the 3 lighthouse keepers that went missing. So pretty creepy stuff. And unfortunately, it's still very much an unsolved mystery, despite the official statement by Robert Moorhead. And so I'd love to hear in the comments what you think might have happened to the lighthouse keepers, and what could possibly explain that there wasn't a storm, but in the journal they said it was the worst storm ever, and there's physical damage done to the island. How do we reconcile that? Either someone's not telling the truth, or something just doesn't add up. And I'd love to hear what you have to say in the comments.